The speculation and questions surrounding Joel Embiid and a possible injury to his knee were added to when we saw footage of him at practice shooting wearing slippers. Initially, he faced some criticism about what he was doing, but then as we learned in a recent ESPN piece by Jackie MacMullan, there might have actually been some method to the madness. Welcome back, everybody. For those new, my name is Brian, and I'm a doctor and a sports fan, and it's my goal here to combine those interests to explain different sports injuries and sports medicine topics to you all in a way that's easier to learn from and understand. Today, we're going to be talking all about this question of whether or not wearing flat shoes could in any way lower your risk of injury. In MacMullan's story, she wrote about how whenever Embiid was rehabbing from his foot injury, he started wearing flat shoes in hopes to try and prevent injuries. This all stemmed from a 2014 study that examined this tribe of peoples in northern Mexico who were known for their really good running distance and having low incidence of injury. Those people were known for wearing these very minimalistic flat type sandals, and so that spawned this belief that maybe wearing minimalistic type shoes or running barefoot was actually beneficial for your health. So we're going to examine that question of whether or not there's any evidence behind this and if it could in any way help Embiid prevent the risk of injuries. As always, go subscribe if you like this type of content and want to stay up to date, and let's get started. This whole fad with barefoot running and flat shoes started back in 2009 when a book came out called Born to Run, in which the author examined ways to try to prevent running injuries and did some research involving this group of people that lived in northern Mexico and were known for their distance running, but also wearing these really thin-soled sandals. They ultimately came to the idea in this book that maybe modern shoes were actually putting us at higher risk of injury, and we should be resorting to this barefoot running style or wearing these minimalistic shoes. Fast forward 10 years later, and as you all know, this has spawned this huge idea about whether or not barefoot running is good, whether or not it's bad, and this whole industry centered around these types of minimalistic shoes. But with 10 years of time, we now have 10 years of additional research trying to answer this question of, is there actually a difference? The general belief is that whenever we wear a traditional shoe versus running barefoot, we have different running styles. With a traditional shoe, we bear a lot of load through the heel with landing, but with a more minimalistic barefoot style shoe, we bear more load through the forefoot, or kind of the ball of the foot. Proponents of this idea say that that barefoot type of shoe invokes a more natural running style that ultimately is less risk of injury. The idea is that whenever you're not wearing this big bulky shoe, you force your foot to conform in more natural ways to building up that innate strength and support that it was intended to have when we evolved and were born. By wearing a big bulky shoe like most people do, you lose that intrinsic foot muscle control and stability that then can put you at risk of injuries. The exact study that was quoted in the story from 2014 took a group of 23 runners from this group of people in northern Mexico and examined how they ran. 13 of them wore these flat shoes and the other 10 wore traditional Western running shoes. Those that wore these flat shoes had an overall stiffer arch. There had been some previous thought that a stiff arch in the foot was overall better in terms of lowering injury risk, and that's what started to spawn this idea of minimalistic shoes and barefoot running. The arch of the foot is this dynamic, load-bearing group of structures in the foot that help provide stability that we need to function. It's a tricky setup because our foot needs to be flexible and loose enough that we can walk on uneven surfaces, but then it needs to be stiff enough at times that it can propel us forward whenever we're running or walking. There's four main things we think about that make up the arch of the foot, the first one being the plantar fascia. If we draw an arc here to signify the arch of the foot, this is what we're trying to keep stable and supported as we're propelling ourselves and running. If someone steps down or pushes low, this arch is going to have a tendency to collapse. That first structure, the plantar fascia, runs basically right across the bottom of that arch from the heel to the toes, and whenever it bears weight, it tenses up to try to keep that arch from bending more and pulling apart. The next group of structures are the intrinsic foot muscles, and these muscles run along that same plane on the bottom of the arch, but are under more active control, where our nervous system can fire at different times to tighten them or tense those muscles to provide more or less stability in the arch. The next group is our extrinsic foot muscles, and these are another group of muscles and tendons. One key one you might have heard about is the posterior tibialis tendon that attaches here to the navicular bone, and when that muscle contracts, it's in a sense pulling the arch upward instead of keeping it from spreading apart at the bottom. The last group is then the ligaments that run between the bones of the foot that again provide that stability and keep the arch from collapsing. So all these structures are trying to work together dynamically as we run to properly stabilize and transfer that load through our foot. If these structures start to fail or become injured in any way, then we can be more predisposed to various injuries in the foot and the whole lower leg. So to simplify it as best I can, proponents of flat shoes or barefoot running believe that it encouraged a stiffer, stronger arch and structural support in the foot that then puts you at lower risk of injuries because you don't have this floppy foot that's collapsing. Let's go then to what the research tells us about whether or not there's any truth or evidence behind this. I'll tell you right off the bat, it's very lacking in terms of the number of good studies that have tried to examine this question of injury risk in people who wear minimalistic flat shoes versus people who wear traditional shoes. A key thing to remember in the context of discussing an NBA player like Embiid is all of these studies are pretty much done in runners. The people who are against these types of footwear say, well, it might decrease injury risk for one type of injury, but it's just going to put you at risk of a different type of injury. Thankfully, though, in 2016, we had a really nice prospective study that came out looking at this question. This means that they collected a group of runners who wore these minimalistic shoes and then a group who wore traditional shoes and follow them prospectively or follow them into the future to look at their injury development and risk to try to answer this question. Whenever they looked at the results, they found that barefoot runners did have overall less musculoskeletal injuries compared to those that wore traditional shoes. So you might think, great, this is good. This shows that you should be barefoot running in order to prevent injuries. Unfortunately, though, whenever they adjusted for the actual number of miles the people were running, there was no difference in the injury development. In my opinion, it's important to make this adjustment, and so I would take this article as saying that really there's no difference when you talk about your risk based on how much you're running. If you remember though, I mentioned how some people in this argument feel that barefoot style running in these flat shoes might decrease one type of injury risk, but increase your risk of another type of injury. Interestingly, in this prospective study I talked about, the people who wore traditional shoes had many more knee and hip injuries, and the people who wore these barefoot style shoes had more lower leg and foot injuries. Barefoot running style involves a shorter stride length and a higher cadence, meaning you take more steps per minute, but you take shorter steps. This results in less load on the hips and knees and is therefore thought to be beneficial for hips and knees. So it's thought to potentially help with things like IT band pain and patellofemoral pain. But unfortunately, that same type of running style puts more load on your Achilles tendon and the intrinsic structures in your foot and makes you more at risk of those types of injuries. So it's really not a conclusive question that we can answer from the current research we have. And I think all the data tells us that we really don't know the complete and final answer yet. It certainly seems like there's different conditions where one running style or one type of shoe over the other is beneficial if you have a specific type of injury, but it doesn't seem like there's one size fits all, so to speak, where one type of shoe or one type of running style is better for everything. Now let's tie this all back to what we started off with here with Embiid in the gym shooting jump shots wearing slippers. Now Embiid claims in the story that he's wearing flat shoes and is a proponent of flat shoes because of this idea of decreasing injury risk. That statement in and of itself is really not specific enough to be able to say whether or not it's going to make a difference. Also, I'd argue that going out and shooting three-pointers wearing slip-on slippers probably puts you at more risk of getting hurt there in the moment from just tripping over your slippers than any sort of potential benefit from being flat-footed. You can wear minimalistic shoes that aren't unsafe like a slipper that have just the same minimal amount of support. So I don't really understand the reason behind needing to have slippers that have this sort of flat foot structure. You can get this in other safe shoes. And so I don't really know if I buy that argument of taking three-pointers and slippers as being helpful for your health. Now, it certainly is possible though, if in the off season or during the season, he's doing a lot of running and he's wearing more of a minimalistic type shoe, that based on whatever possible injuries or symptoms he's having, it might show some benefit in terms of lowering his injury risk. I don't really know of any basketball shoes that are flat, similar to like a minimalistic running shoe. And so you could argue that if that's what he's performing in, that that's what he should be training in, but there might be some benefit from training in the off season or doing prolonged runs while wearing a minimalistic flat type of shoe. Like I said, all this data we have and kind of all the anecdotal evidence is looking just at runners, not basketball players, not people who are jumping. And so it's hard to really generalize that research to someone like Embiid. I hope you guys learned something in this video reviewing this question of why these types of shoes might be beneficial, and then taking a look at the research behind whether or not it decreases the risk of injury in runners or athletes. Like I said, we don't really have a for sure answer about if one is good versus the other. It seems to be more of an individualistic type of question that you have to answer based on that specific person or based on what your history is in the past. As always, let me know any questions or comments you guys have below, and until next time, thanks for watching and we'll see you later. Bye.